Take a look. Yeah, and if you say your question, I think we have a microphone running around, but if not, then I'll just repeat your question.
So your point on the number of people in a house is especially, I think, important. I think about my family. In 1983, 5 of us occupied one house in Humboldt County.
Yep.
Now 7 of us occupy 4 houses.
That's right.
In Humboldt County. So a 40% increase in population, or 40% increase in population, a 400% increase in demand for housing. That being said, we still get data from the state that just shows that population, and so the data that comes down for the RENA and some of the other stuff, and even local planning and housing elements, really doesn't talk about the nature of that. You know, is there any effort at the state level, I hope, to try to make more complex and actually more reality-based those housing needs and projections, or are we still just going to do number of people, number of units?
Yep, you got it. The latter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yay.
Yeah. There is no what I would say out of the box thinking about that. The only 2 things I would say, and it's more in our urban areas than our suburban or rural, is if we're going to have 30% unoccupied office space, there are a lot of city council members and boards of supervisor members who believe that that is prime to not change the footprint of the area, but to jam more housing units in. Developers in general will tell you that that is not going to work based on water availability, sewer availability, parking availability, traffic flows, all the things that if you've ever done a development project or consulted on one, you fight about for months in council, sometimes to get rejected and do it all over again, that you think you just put a magic wand over and put, you know, instead of having a mall there, now you have an apartment complex. The problem is you might have to raise the mall to then rebuild and then change all the infrastructure. It's a round peg, square hole in some cases, or the other way around. I can't remember how that analogy works. But that's the idea. So don't expect out of the box thinking it'll be lather, rinse, repeat in 2031 to 2039 when RENA is done all over again. It can be if you don't think the problem's being solved. In some cases, I think when you walk out of chambers, okay, that's it. We tick the box and we're on to the next 8-year run.
So, hey, Rob, this is Melinda.
How are you?
It's good to see you.
Good to see you too.
So I have 2 technical questions for you, and if these are unfair, just tell me.
Sure.
So the first one is, I personally am dismayed that the Fed has a goal of 2% inflation instead of 2.5 or 3%, because the 2% is really going to suppress wage growth, which is one of our...
Oh, I think it's back
Did
on
I
now.
break it?
No, you're good.
Okay. For a long time. So that's my first question.
Yep.
So if you could hit that, and then I'm going to...
Oh, totally. So in terms of the Fed, so remember that graph I showed you with the blue dotted line and the blue solid line, the inflation graph? Melinda's referring to the idea that shouldn't we move that blue, and change this if it's not correct, that the blue dotted line should actually be, it's okay to move that up a tad, right? We shouldn't be so sort of religiously connected to the idea it's got to be 2% or nothing. The way economists believe the 2% works, and the reason why the world has kind of adopted this, is because by having it at 2%, you're keeping the inflation moving at a slow and low pace to where the labor market, which will basically have a bunch of different anomalies, will not have a super high inflation, or meaning super high, meaning out of the bound of error around the 2%, to catch up to for workers. So it sort of gives a sort of a relative balance between giving workers an increasing standard of living without forcing quick wage change on employers, especially smaller ones. But the other piece of it is capital flow. So if you have higher inflation than 2%, interest rates are going to remain relatively high also. And if you deviate from how most of the other financially emerged world is looking at its inflation, your interest rates, even at 0.25% higher on average than, let's say, Western Europe, will mean a bunch of investors are going to move toward your country with their cash and abandon the country of origin because you're giving that 0.25% difference. So you'll notice if you look worldwide, New Zealand, Western Europe, Japan, Australia, the UK, all have 2% as basically their stated goal. Why? Because they don't want to fight each other over finance. So those are the 2 points of why 2% kind of lingers around, even though we're much more hand-wavy about it than, let's say, the area that uses the euro, places like Norway and New Zealand who have rule-based around 2%. That's why the 2% remains and is going to be maybe a little hard to move around.
Okay, I guess I can buy that.
Okay.
But
I know that's
think
more technical maybe than you wanted, but that's in the inner sanctum. That's why it still remains. Believe it or not.
I still think it's pretty low. Anyway.
Yep.
So my other question is, once we actually start counting cannabis jobs, wouldn't a lot of them still be counted as non-farm and not impact your analysis?
100%. So they'll be counted as farm in Humboldt, Mendocino County, which right now has, I think, somewhere on the order of 45-ish% of the cultivation licenses in California. So it's a really big footprint on the farm side, and then it slides way down when you look at manufacturing, distribution, and retail in these two counties. So you're going to see a real pop in farming. The hope is that over time, farming, manufacturing, distribution, and some niche retail will start to spring up in all these North Coast counties because there's now more vertical integration possible. Right now, your markets are some other place. So distribution and retail live some other place, and you want that to be for right now. But the more tourism the elements become, you can kind of merge those sets. So, and that's why I think the wine industry is a decent industry to look at as a model, is can you get it to where people want to come there, and you can squish that supply chain all in one place so you can generate the highest possible retail outcome. But when the jobs go live, especially in Humboldt, Mendocino, it will be primarily in ag, not non-ag. When you go to Sonoma County, it'll be more balanced because of the manufacturing, distribution, and retail that lives there vis-a-vis what's farmed.
We have another question. I didn't see build housing on the opportunities list, yet you highlight it as a problem.
Did I actually have housing building as a problem? So if you've tried to get homes built in these 4 counties, and this is also true moving toward the Bay Area and to a certain extent in the Bay Area, there's a large amount of cost. Those costs have been exacerbated by the recent inflation for developers. So the problem is if you think that build them and they will come, you have to be thinking about who's actually going to show up. Right? I think, and you kind of talked about it with your example, right? If you build, the hope is that your kids will come back. But what you might end up doing is building a bunch of homes, either A, for people not going to want them, because they're either too big or too small based on the audience that's going to be here, but you also don't want to not build because then people won't be able to come here and live. So one of the nasty parts about home building is that there is no sort of general way of envisioning, if I build a home, what's the implication of that for economic and workforce development? That's almost never discussed. Here's a number of units I've got to build. How do I get there? The cool thing is if you come to me with a 120 unit apartment complex, boy, that ticks a lot of boxes in terms of hitting that number, so I don't have my assembly person or senator calling me and saying, hey, what's going on with those housing units? But are those 120 units of apartments the right play for the mix of professionals and service jobs you want to come? That's the challenge. So I'm sorry if I didn't articulate that very well. Does that help? Does that help answer your question? Yeah, and so your politicians need to be okay with building a wide variety of housing that matches what you think you want to see on economic and workforce development, and be okay if you've got 400 or 500 units that aren't selling at the pace you thought they would, because, and this is the nasty part of it, that's good for housing affordability. But houses don't go into chambers on Tuesday and complain about the fact you let 500 units go, now my house price is 15% lower. That logic is poor, but it's the logic that moves policy. So housing affordability and just construction as being the sort of panacea for that problem, unfortunately is not going to work for most of the politics that live west of I-80 west of I-5 in California.
Kevin Malone from Del Norte. And so I've been saying to friends and family for the last couple of years, we live in the cool Lost Coast as everything else is warming up. So I'm wondering, in these forecasts, where does climate change come in? Because we get climate refugees, we get fire refugees, we get people moving from the coast to Del Norte. Our home prices have gone through the roof. We have people working remotely, buying houses that local people can't afford anymore. And we don't have a lot, the job thing is still there. But I'm just wondering, because we have this climate that's going to stay relatively cool compared to a lot of other places. So I can't imagine our population going down in the next 10 years. I think it's going to double.
Sure. And then it kind of comes back to the same question. Do you have the housing stock that would attract that audience? And do you have the other infrastructure that would attract it? How fast your internet speeds are? Where are they available? Do you have general Wi-Fi? Is it someplace that I can move and do something from a remote, meaning that you're basically doing economic and workforce and community development simultaneously? Those would be the questions to ask in terms of, can you actually sustain population growth? Are all the infrastructure parts there that somebody will move there and stay long term? The other thing about this, folks, and this is something we'll see how it play out over the next couple of years, is we know that there are people that have moved to these 4 counties from the core Bay Area because they visited here for a long period of time, and as soon as the couple saw that they could move away and work from home, they went and they came here, right? If they have to go back to the city, what's that going to leave in the wake? We don't know yet. So that's another phenomenon that until that's 100% sifted, there still may be some volatility in local labor, merchant, and housing markets to be seen.
We have 2 more questions. One from this group. How can the region beyond Humboldt Bay take advantage of wind power projects in Humboldt Bay? So,
Is be a place where there's some other products that are being developed alongside of that innovation, or either workers that are going to work in those spaces can live, and then that can lead to those concentric circles. That's the key, is what's the wind power going to mean? So if you look at places like Scotland, as a way of thinking about how wind power has created jobs in the north coast of Scotland, that's a really good model to think about. Where are those concentric circles? I haven't looked at that in depth, but that's what I've read a little bit about it, is that's where you really see the change. Is either new products that are coming out that are now enhanced because the wind power exists where it does, or that are servicing those windmills that weren't there previously.
Hi, Natalie Arroyo, Humboldt County. I am curious about something that I struggle with, is making sense of all the labor force information. It seems to me like we're going to need people that we don't currently have, but I'm not sure if I'm interpreting that correctly. I wonder if you could speak to what you think as far as attracting people to our communities, and some thoughts around that.
Absolutely. So, and it kind of goes back to the Del Norte idea that what infrastructure do you have in place that would be analogous to what you'd see maybe in an urban area with a rural, almost weather never changing setting, or a place that you're never going to find better weather in some cases, that would keep someone there long term. So and my thought is this, especially for Humboldt County, when the final investments come in, which hopefully are not in question to Cal Poly Humboldt, how does that lead to 2 things at once? One, the natural growth of the university, but then what can we do in the private sector that would spin off of that natural growth that would then have sort of synergistic effects on Eureka, Arcata, and beyond, right? That's the key, because that will now draw, especially if it's a center of excellence in sort of a hand-wavy way, but a place where there's niche things happening that maybe only 1 or 2 other places in the world are happening, and you want to be there for intellectual, scientific, work reasons, and you draw that crowd in. Then you start to get all the services growth around it, but you have to be prepared for that, right? Y'all have had some housing concerns, right, recently. That's an unfortunate opportunity cost of saying, we're actually going to put a flag in the ground and say, we're going to start growing jobs in ways we've never seen in this area, and we're going to ask the world to come here and work and live. And everybody who's currently in a house right now and trying to buy is going to say, well, hold on a minute, what's that mean for me? So that's the nasty part of it, is that you have to be bold about the way you look at that and say that we have a completely different way of looking 20 years from now than what we're currently at, and here's how we're going to get there. There's going to be some cost in the wake. Somebody's going to have to bear that. It's just part of the gig, unfortunately. But you've got to figure out ways in which that you are unique in a highly competitive market.
Robert, I have a question actually around small business development, and how do you see that playing? I mean, so many of our 4 counties rely on our small businesses, and this is, a lot of new talk of new industries, new diversifications, challenges with climate. How do we better prepare those small businesses? It's not just about getting capital, it's about being prepared for what's coming next.
Yeah, is try to be as lean as possible. Unfortunately, the outlook for small to medium-sized businesses, given what we've seen the last 3 years, is not good, just to give it to you straight up. Your downtowns will change over the next 5 years in ways that you probably hope they would not, but they will. And you'll probably see more retail, more office, maybe more restaurant vacancy because of that. It's not a good picture looking forward, unfortunately.
It's unfortunate because that is actually dovetailing off what you were, that's why people come. I mean,
Oh,
people
100%.
come
Yeah, the
for
small
that.
town feel. It's locally owned. It's
Yeah.
unique.
Right.
But they come here as a visitor. But if you try to run a business here, you need that sort of blend of visits and local population that are patronizing your business. And there is a global competitive audience to try to take those dollars away. And that's just been grinding along. And now the cost of doing business has gone up in such a way that it's hard to imagine that it won't have at least some general cost on our local communities, especially, unfortunately, our locally owned businesses.
Hi everyone, my name is Lupe Garcia from PolicyLink. I'm a visitor to your region. I just want to say thank you so much for walking through all this presentation as a non-econ person. And someone who's scared of graphs, like you explained it really well. I think one thing, it's a bigger picture question, one thing that I feel was missing from this narrative was just like the role and responsibility of big corporations. I feel they just have had a big, I just keep hearing about how there's a lot of, they're like record-breaking profits, right? And like what is the correlation of that with the impacts of our economy, right? I feel like we're suffering a lot because of a few select corporations have really been operating in ways that are just really impacting our workers and small businesses, right? Like I heard about you saying, oh, it's small businesses and medium businesses that don't want to raise their wages, but I think it's a lot of it's corporations too. And to the previous question, I feel there is a role in corporations. So I would love to hear your thoughts about that, just like, and also can we rein them in? And I also have a follow-up comment.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So to give you a very quick answer to that, that's unfortunately part of a market economy. Right? If I have wealth and I have an ability to invest and I invest that and I want to profit from that, you're either competitive or you're not. This is a long, centuries-old view of that sort of friction between the haves and the have-nots in the corporate world. So it's part of the game, unfortunately. We really have not had a single way of regulating that. As an example of what might happen in this area, you may have to rely on relatively global corporate money to come in to really shock this area for those new science jobs or those new types of industries that you're looking for. So one of the nasty parts about it is if you don't have $2 billion to invest from the private sector through local investment, that might have to come from a global corporate player just to move the ball forward at a pace that will give you something bigger 10 years from now. The blue economy, if that's the focus of where things are going from an economic and workforce development standpoint, is probably not going to move forward at a high pace without inbound global investment. And that's going to come from big corporations, not from some alum from Humboldt State University who made billions of dollars and said, yes, I'd like to now reinvest. Even that person's going to come in and say, where's the profit?
Right.
So you're asking a gigantic philosophical question, at least from my angle. It's a great question to ask, but there is no strong solution. And sometimes you kind of need that money to get off the ground because it's going to go somewhere. The beauty of it coming here is it can solve a bunch of problems at once. It just, now the opportunity cost side, the natural part of it is it doesn't come cost free.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Nancy Olson. I'm with the Greater Eureka Chamber of Commerce. And your statement about small businesses being short of luck, is there anything, and I guess I'm asking the room as well as you, that small businesses can do to increase their resilience during economic shifts like this?
Yeah, what I normally tell people when I get this question is partner along your supply chain, meaning that if you're a business that relies on tourism, is there something you can do in a partnership way to be a better advertised package for people to come and visit you because it's a slightly more complete experience by coming to stay and to play, if you want to say it that way, even though I know that sounds very corny. But is there a way you can put that together, right? So thinking about partnerships. Chambers are great at doing that. You might have to get a little bit more focused on packaging just to look more competitive on the outside. And what's nasty about visitor flow is that in some ways, local retail and local restaurants need that flow of people to stay alive during the more lean months where it's not there. And we have an entire economy built up, especially along the coastline when you start with Mendocino going north, that needs that flow of people to give that extra revenue and that boost. But it's going to become more and more competitive, and we've already seen that. And even things that you're totally out of your control. When you run out of water in the village of Mendocino, how do you figure that one out, right? When they don't run out of water in Sonoma and Napa counties. So people say, well, why would I go to a place where I don't know if I can take a shower? I'll just stop in Sonoma and Napa. Well, that just immediately excluded that revenue from a bunch of different merchants. So I usually say partnerships is the best way, but it's not, it's not a sort of, complete solution to the problem. But that's usually the place I'd look at first. And then you should also look at infrastructure. Do you have infrastructure to bring more market here versus just how we're, FedEx and UPS is driving more to our homes, which is bringing stuff in from the outside.
So you touched on it there, but I was also curious how tourism as a sector didn't come up in your report today. And certainly the SEDS report for Del Norte, and I don't know about the other counties, it's like central to.
100%. So I kind of talked about it in passing in terms of the infrastructure piece, but as far as I know, there are dedicated assets for tourism, but not a 100% complete niche global competitive strategy. Right? How do you stand out against myriad possibilities, especially when you got 6.5 million people that live in 5 counties in the Bay Area who want to travel? Why would they come 125 miles north rather than 25? What's the reason I should spend my money and my time getting there? Can you put a ferry that would go from San Francisco to Eureka Orcata? Can you do that? Is that possible? Would that change the game? Can you get more air service out of Humboldt County? Can you get that then linked quickly to Del Norte? Not another hour and a half of this weird drive. 100%, right? So think infrastructure is the best way to support that, but that means kind of a leap out of the box of the norm saying, well, United and American are going to want to fly more out of Humboldt. If the demand's not there, they're not coming. I mean, Santa Rosa Airport's a really good microcosm of that evolution where they had airlines come, they've had airlines go. If people aren't buying tickets, they're going to go. So you need to have a thought about, if you wanted to do a tourism strategy, how would you get them there in a globally competitive environment, and how would you keep them there non-day tripping, because that's where the juice is the overnight stay. It's not where I come by, okay, we're driving through to Oregon, let's stop here, let's get lunch, and then keep going. You want them to stay overnight. That's where all the revenue generation is. And again, that comes back to the packaging. If you get them to stay there overnight, get them to spend while they're there because there's a package they can spend on.
I've got a question. Both yesterday and today in a lot of these conversations, there's 2 very different meanings of equity, one of which is around fairness and the other is around ownership. And I'm curious if you could just comment on the difference between those in this conversation and best strategies for local people to increase their equity in terms of the ownership side, where we're seeing land consolidation, larger entities coming in and purchasing forest lands, agricultural lands, the cannabis industry consolidating. And so if you have strategies for building that second kind of ownership equity, and also, can you clarify the difference between those? Because I think they sometimes get really muddied.
Yeah, so I always think, and I have this picture in my head of 3 people at a fence line where one person can see over the fence and one person can't see over the fence. So equality is when I let you get to the fence line. Equity is when I actually get both of you with the same view over the fence. So in terms of fairness, fairness might come because you weren't able to gain access to the fence line and now I got you there. But if you can't get to the height that somebody else is, then it's not equitable. Does that make sense? I don't have a great strategy on the other one. If I have a family who's got 840 acres of pasture land in Sonoma and Marin counties. There's been a lot of hand-waving about what it's worth. But my mom has, this is my mom's family, my mom has 5 siblings. They're all still alive. So no one has, the dominoes, again, as cold-blooded as this is going to sound, they haven't been flicked yet in such a way to know what the next stage is going to be when one person's out of the equation. Hopefully not my mother first, but I'd love them all the same, more or less. The point is that we as a family, and this is true for a lot of agricultural families, by the way, in California and beyond. What do you do with an aging population that has been working in agriculture and thus are kind of the landowners in some ways, or the natural resource owner, as they age, and no one wants to take over that business, but they see millions on the other side if the land is sold, which then finances my home in South Carolina, my home in Italy, and my mortgage at home now is wiped away, right? What's that mean? right? And I don't intend to become a sheep or cattle farmer full-time again. My family, there may be pressure because there's 6 of my mom, there's 4 of us in that next generation. What's going to happen? So if you're dangling money over me, it's going to be easy to do that. Now, there have been some, innovations around agricultural land trusts that if they have the money can maybe go on and do some of that work. But the families are going to have to agree that that's the best path forward for them too, vis-a-vis what the market might provide. And usually there's land trusts around developable water more than just land itself for the reasons of agriculture. So I don't really have a great strategy, unfortunately. That's a nasty, real nasty social conundrum where we have a lot of agricultural families or landowners that are aging out in terms of decades long or even generations long land ownership.
This is Allie Lee with Humboldt Area Foundation and Wild Rivers Community Foundation. There's another equity conversation that we've been having, and it's a racial equity conversation. And I'd like to bring that lens back to these conversations about housing, about economic development, about cannabis, as was brought up, about tribal land trusts, right? About generational wealth and investment that can't get passed on if people don't have access and entree. And so if we're going to do the same things in the same way, we're going to keep running across the same problems. And so one of the earlier presenters brought up that wage gap in companies, and that's part of this equation. And the nonprofit sector as an economic development piece is part of the way forward in these more rural counties that we also serve. We don't serve Lake, we serve Humboldt, Trinity, Del Norte, and Curry County up there in Oregon, which is not in the room, but has very similar economic and social and historical challenges that Del Norte has. And then also, we've been talking about past 2 days, the disaster economy. There's a lot of potential there to fold a lot of this in a different lens where the disaster economy and those jobs are related to prescribed burns, cultural burns, housing that's more sustainable and resilient, products like hempcrete that are more sustainable and resilient. This is part of that conversation, and I'd like to bring those pieces back into our dialogue here today.
And if you think that there's something that's happened here from a disaster standpoint that gives you a leg up on other places that have seen disasters, and you can actually start innovating and using entrepreneurship around what can we do here that would actually be seen as a niche product that would actually start generating jobs here specific to that outcome, that's where the juice is on that. So be thinking that way. Is there something unique about where we are that tells a story that no one else can tell, that we can actually now generate jobs from that and do it in a way that helps us and maybe helps the world?
Okay, a few more questions. I do have a question on the blue economy and the awareness of the Noyo Marine Science Center that is evolving and how that might play into the overall coastal communities.
It should be part of the partnership, absolutely. Any place where science is happening that can help expand that and bring that sort of across the region is a positive partnership. You want that.
Hi, I'm Ursula Bischoff. I am an independent consultant working with CCRP here to help convene the SURF process and facilitate some of the local planning tables. Curious about markets. Specifically, SURF also wants to encourage interregional partnerships and collaboration. And I know that in a lot of ways, our region is more similar perhaps to the rest of the Pacific Northwest. And we're really focused on markets down to the Bay Area. So I'm curious to know whether the state is really thinking about projections beyond California and looking at geographies and scale, like landscape-wide, I don't have the right language for it, but you know what I mean.
Yep.
So what can you say about analyses that help us think more creatively about markets, about how we develop, where we develop?
The state does not have that plan and might resist any gains from that SURF money that slip over the Oregon border. So watch for that a little bit. But you should be, from a marketing standpoint, once these funds are deployed in California, there's no reason to think south is the only place to go. Okay, so you should plan for a wider, more like, thinking east in all directions, south, north, and pure east. That's, I would think of them all. So yeah, but I would be very cautious on the political side to walk into chambers and say, hey, guess what, guys? Well, we're going to deploy the SURF money. What we really need to do is slip it over the border in Oregon. And then here's why. They might be very resistant to that. So I think part of it's political. They haven't talked one lick about that yet, is because they want most of those gains to remain in California if possible. But that may not be realistic the closer and closer you get to Oregon. And that's why you got to think, step one, yes, we've spent it. Step two, we thought bigger than this, and now it's going to really move out beyond state borders, and that's okay.
Hi, my name is Brenda Perez from Centro del Pueblo in Humboldt County. My question is in the light of social movements that are asking for migratory reforms, paths to citizenship. So how will these reforms could impact the economy? Thinking of specialized labor force, people that is long-time residents that are undocumented and that are already there. So how in the past, but maybe also in the forecast that you are providing, could these reforms impact these economies in the North Coast?
And can you give me an example of a reform you're talking about?
The amnesties in the aid, for example, and so providing citizenship,
Right.
and having regular labor force.
Sure. So under the supposition that we will have a problem that will reduce the pathway to citizenship, which maybe is at the heart of your question, or is that if we actually provide more citizenship, what's the positive aspect of that? Sure. If we do that, I think it would provide a more complete grounding of that workforce that's already here and has been working diligently and very hard over for decades, and that's the trick of it, is that we don't see that in the numbers. Right? So we know that those are also underestimates for all the undocumented workers that are providing taxable sales, jobs, and sort of in concentric circles around what they do because of their spending, jobs beyond. But we don't talk a lot about that in Sacramento. Those things they're not in the data. I think the reforms would be good to put a hot light positively on that population and talk about how productive it has been, and this is why we're making the investment. But the political resistance is probably going to linger through most of this decade.
And just to complement that idea, because it's not popular to talk about that, we see
Correct.
the campaigns and then the fights for the jobs, etc. So I would encourage really to economists to put the accent on those type of reforms and link it to have this prosperity and also some fairness for the undocumented migrants.
Yeah, and to be dead honest with you, as a sort of a hit on my profession, we have never, even though we know this issue has existed as economists, we have never said, okay, let's go ahead and finance a way of regularly tracking someone. Let's put a 5-person team on it. How can we look at the data and come up with what we think is a relatively precise number that says this is what's going on now with that population, so we know it's there.